Hello, everyone. This is Trip. And today on the podcast, we're going to talk about Jesus in popular songs and specifically, we're going to get down to Jesus songs for Christmas and Advent. So I have here my friend Dell, who is a scholar of music, pop music, and also composes, but also a theology nerd. So Dell, thank you for coming and hanging out.
I'm happy to be here, man.
So how do you introduce yourself as a scholar at the kind of these different intersections?
I mean, my training's as a classical musician, as a composer, and then, um, but I didn't go to conservatory for college. I went to an undergrad. I got a BA because I always knew I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to learn broadly and teach broadly, but I didn't really get into pop music and therefore sort of more scholarly work until like my after grad school, actually. I always just described myself as a professor because, man, scratch me and a lecture will come out. Also, I'm a white guy. So I like calling myself a professor who teaches on music and culture. But when you're in a different space and you can code switch a bit among the theologians, or the musicians, you use different phrases and it sort of comes through quick, you
Yeah.
know. Most of my scholarly work is I really have a public facing career. I'm just trying to create stuff that is relevant to normal people. And as a classical musician, I know that's tough. And actually, in the theology world, people like yourself, other people are figuring out ways, to do it.
Mhm.
I like to describe myself as a professor, a writer, and the scholar thing is kind of the last check mark. You know,
Well, one of the things that I really like about your new project, and we'll definitely link to everything on the post wherever you're finding this or listening to this, is is looking at Jesus in kind of contemporary pop culture music, like at the advent of pop music, through its history, really gives like a fascinating lens when you contrast it with the rest of Western, music. Like most of Western, largely the history of music in the West, the church was the funder and the venue and all this kind of thing for music. So, like, as someone who's much more familiar with that history and the changing shape, how do you see the advent, in a sense, of pop music from thinking about the religious questions? Like, how did it become a site for theological reflection that's different than, say, much of the composition prior?
Man, that's a great question. Well, you're right that basically, if you say the word sacred music today, and if you're referring to Christian music, first of all, you're thinking overwhelmingly of music meant for worship. And if you're talking classical music, you're talking liturgical music. That's like Gregorian chant, but also cantatas by Bach or anthems that you hear like an Anglican or Episcopal church, mainliners. But of course, you're also thinking about praise and worship. And you're also talking about Black gospel. So these are all different kinds of music that are either funded by the church community, I'd say, whether they're literally by the denomination or the church, or they're funded by a company, a record label that's creating music to be used in a service, right? And that happens today. The project I'm working on is songs that are from secular artists. Now, some of these secular artists might be practicing Christians, right? A lot of them aren't. For many of them, no one knows and no one cares, right? But what draws this project together, the songs I'm looking at, are the fact that they're all songs that are about Jesus or feature Jesus in some way, but they're all coming from the secular recording world, right? Even if you're, again, like U2 is the best example, right? You got some Christians there, but they don't release Christian music. It's not CCM, right? They release in the secular label. So the question is like, when did this start to happen, right? And the why question is another one, right? But the when is pretty clear. I mean, I found about 600 songs from the last, from the sort of the history of modern pop music that feature Jesus in some way, all by secular artists, released on secular labels. It really doesn't start until the very end of the 1960s, which, if you're keeping track at home, modern the rock and roll era started in like 1954, 55, which is when you had this explosion of Black popular music in the consciousness of white people. And basically white record labels said, wow, we can sell to teenagers by promoting this kind of music as opposed to crooners and, Frank Sinatra, stuff like that. Right. So if you say that's sort of the real fulcrum in the history of pop music, mid 50s, then of course you get the rock and roll era, and things start to change in the 60s, where you start to get this fragmentation of pop music, and you start to move essentially into the mid 60s with the influence of the counterculture and of mind altering substances. You start to get just an increased interest in consciousness, spirituality, mysticism, right? And first you
Definitely.
get that in the secular world. You get that through Timothy Leary, LSD. You start to get that through Eastern spirituality as well. The Beatles go to India. You start to get all the British progressive rock bands that are trying to explore consciousness and mysticism, right? And then I think that sort of opens up the question. And then really what you do is you get Jesus Christ Superstar. 1970, you get a progressive concept rock album, because don't forget, that was a record before it was a show and a movie. It was a concept album where you had singers from great British prog rock bands and blues rock bands telling the story. And the music was and is great. And I think at that point, somebody saw, either record labels or artists saw, that pop music, secular music that's good and that explores questions of the Jesus and the Christian tradition, that's going to either sell or it's going to just be interesting to critics and listeners. And that's when the floodgates open. And you start to get more and more and more. And I think that the pace of actually Jesus songs is increasing and has been increasing over even the last 10, 15 years.
That's really fascinating, because like if you were to take that timeline of kind of the emergence of pop music, the role it plays right in extended adolescence in kind of Western culture, the way music came to so shape one's own identity, then you get pop music getting this kind of binary, right? Like, oh, here's the Christian music over here. So like through the 70s, really out of the Jesus People movement, in the 70s, you have tame Christian pop music. And then the 80s, praise the Lord for Stryper and company, things get wild into CCM and through the 90s and early aughts, which then ultimately becomes worship music centric and blends with pop country. But that whole trajectory of let us create our own then left in some sense this space, especially if you take a conservative framing of sacred versus secular, right, where what do you do with art? Well, art's always been even in times where everyone around you had the same religion, where you ask these big questions about being human, living before you die, what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, all these kinds of big questions. Then in some sense, by tracking this figure the West has wrestled with, Jesus, you start to see the way these questions about meaning, purpose, value, goodness, ethics, and justice and such migrate outside the walls of Christendom and then erupt in these songs where human beings are doing what they do in this extended modern adolescence of identity formation and figuring out who we are and wrestling with our religious inheritance.
Eruption is a great verb to use, right? I mean, it feels like an eruption, right? And because it feels like, well, look at the hymns that you might sing. I don't care if they're, old Anglican hymns or if they're like Charles Wesley or whatever. Not a lot of those hymns, not a lot of the texts really wrestle with like what it means to be a Christian in the here and now. A lot of them are theological, but a lot of them they're not really wrestling with theology. They're describing theology, traditional Orthodox theology, in ways that normal people understand, right? Let's think about like revival hymns. And that's true for spirituals as well, though you can argue the Black spirituals are doing much more of this, right? Which leads into gospel. But at the same time, the goal of Christian music, sacred music, whether it's CCM today, like worship music, or Bach, was to help a couple of things. First of all, because they're presented liturgically or in worship, to help create a community in the special moment for an hour a week, which is a safe place where you can worship God, and music creates community. It's like when we sing the national anthem at Fenway Park. Suddenly, it's all of us singing as one. Music does that amazingly. That's why all regimes either create anthems or basically proscribe communal singing, because it's dangerous, community forming. But the words, if you look at like music that's used, very, very few of the words in CCM or Bach are really challenging the church. And have you ever sung a hymn in church that says, Jesus, I don't know if you're there, and I don't know what to believe, and I don't know what to do? No, I don't care how progressive. But guess what? There are dozens of pop songs that do just that.
Yeah.
And
we even dodge those psalms in the liturgy.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Exactly.
The Psalms ask it, but at church we don't.
I love it. That reminds me, when I was in Gatlinburg a couple of years ago, I was at one of those Christian tchotchke stores, and there was a whole bunch of like psalm stones, and it was like, and they all little quotes, and I was like, "Where's the quote about the dashing the kids' heads against the stone? Like, that's perfect for this little psalm stone." It wasn't there, man. A little dark. I'm sorry, but so my point is that
you're officially against dashing children's heads.
Officially, yes, I can go on the record. Okay. I just, if you're going to sell a psalm stone, that's the obvious one, right? Yeah. I also love the t-shirts, man. I saw there. I'm from Boston, so it's a different world for me. But yeah, so the amazing thing is that you've got all these songs that are doing exactly what you say. These pop songs they're current. They're asking all the questions that like all Christians ask. We all have asked always, but we've just never really been able to ask literally in the church building, in communal worship, and because these songs are released on Virgin Records, nobody cares. There's no thought control. These artists aren't worried about being excommunicated from their community, and what happens, and probably the more provocative these songs are, the more they're going to speak to the needs of Christians who are looking for an authentic response, some kind of terrain where they can hear their questions voiced, and then they can chew on them without fear, Yeah. And it's a really weird phenomenon that really can only happen in our secular age, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe let me throw something out, but I want you to kind of expand on that, because when we use the phrase secular age, at least for me, it's so much Charles Taylor runs through my head. Yeah. And one of in his kind of giant book magnum opus, the book Secular Age, for those that don't know. Also, there's a whole class where I read this with Andrew Root, which if you're interested, go check it out. But one of the observations he makes about our secular age is that we thought, meaning like the intellectual class telling the story about the development, in scare quotes, of the West, is we got smart, we got wise, and then things just get more secular because we don't need fuddy-duddy religion anymore. And he's like, well, that's wrong. Now, why? What's going on? Is one of the things he brings to the fore is that for most of Western history, you had such a homogenous local community and a lack of connections to the diversity of the species that most of the people you interacted with shared the same big story of religion, regardless of which one it was. Even if you think of when Protestantism erupts after they break up, you're usually even around your particular kind of Protestants and such. Yeah. So once you don't share this big framework with everyone, you still are tasked with these same human questions. But now there's like a multiplicity of big stories religious traditions bring, and every variation running around. Also, those questions don't go away if you think for science, philosophical reasons, problem of evil, whatever, that the big other, God or whatnot, doesn't work. You still have all these big human questions we have to ask. And even if, let's say, you're me or you who are at home and can sit in a worship space and take it seriously, and we help to construct everything, we also can completely understand people that are on the outside of it giggling and going, look at them, that's so funny, and it's like he uses the term fragilization of belief. That even if you hold a conviction, because everyone around you doesn't share it, you hold it differently. And yet we're tasked with being human. And so in that space, how does in some sense, secular spaces become the place where the most sacred questions can be asked, because the homogenizing inheritance of religious inertia of any, cathedral or worship space isn't present. Right, like that to me is what's so exciting about your project. But I'd love to hear you expand it, because this is Tripp's reading of what you were doing.
Well, you're 100% right. And one of the coolest things is that, so if I asked you, okay, Tripp, I want to explore the question of evil. Okay, the problem of evil. Or let me ask you, how about the possibility of faith today? And I said, please give me a reading list of theologians that have grappled with this. And it would be very easy for you to initially give me 100 articles or books by white European dudes, right? And because you would also have on the tip of your fingers lots of recent current work by people that don't fit that description, right?
Yes.
When it comes to pop music, there are, again, I found dozens and dozens and dozens of songs that raise these questions, but the vast majority are not white guys. We have voices that are not just at the table, like they built the building, and they are African Americans, they are women, they are members of the LGBTQ community, they are atheists, right? They are all, literally every group of people that has been systematically excluded from the theological conversation, from the academy and no offense, but we know how it works. Yet here they are they are the voices that are literally the loudest if you look at pop music as a source of theological thought and questioning. So that's what's really cool, because you are getting this diversity in ways that we've never seen in the church before, and is even hard to bring into the conversation now. Do you know what I mean? And so, like, on the website I created for this project, you can actually search by certain topics, and you can immediately get a whole bunch of testimonies and questions by a really diverse group of people.
In kind of surveying it and looking it over, why Jesus, right? I get that we have these kind of big questions that philosophers of religion love to see how different religious traditions wrestle with them and how different artists do it and all that kind of stuff. But when you look at the different artists and then their decision, right, to go to rest Jesus in song, what about Jesus is ultimately alluring for someone writing songs about these big questions that aren't right in a room where everyone's like, oh, Jesus, you mean my Savior and Lord? Tell me more. Second person of the Trinity, image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation. Oh, I'd love to hear about this, Del. Like who is Jesus for pop culture, in a sense, when it's post Christendom?
Well, the question about why he's this pervasive figure is certainly, if I'm just to answer that, I'd have to sort of surmise, right? It's a much bigger question, and that goes to the fact that he has been an attractive figure for visual artists, right, and writers for since 33 AD, right, or since the Gospels or Paul, whatever, right? They're all doing the same thing. Who's this Jesus? And so what motivated Paul to write was a visionary experience, right? And I think that's just a difference of degree, not kind, from the reason why Aerosmith wrote Street Jesus, right? Which I think is that he is I think there's a couple of things, and jump in here because I'm just sort of talking, I'm just surmising here. One is it's in the incarnation. The fact that the idea is that you mean as a human, you can tell me I can understand God by getting to know a human? Like, I get that. Like, I can start from there. I can work with that, because I understand another human. And so that's incarnational, right? That's kind of part of the plan. Way to go, God. I think you got it right. The second thing is that Jesus is I think if you read the Gospels, he's a rock and roller, man. I mean, look, he lives by his own creed. He commands a room with his verbal ability. He's a superstar, right? I mean, like Jesus Christ Superstar was a great show, partially and record because it recasts Jesus. It doesn't recast, it honors that identity that is borne out by the Gospels, right? And I think the third thing is that a lot of secular artists are former evangelicals. And we all know just how important Jesus is. The idea that Jesus is close by and is my friend and walks with me and talks with me, that's just a core part of what it means to be Christian for evangelicals. And I'm a former evangelical, and it is so core to me still, which is why I'm writing a book on Jesus and not about God, right? So those are my sort of three ideas, as to why,
yeah.
you know what I mean? I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
Oh,
but,
no. So the incarnation one, in some sense, like you're deciding to wrestle with a figure that the Christendom said, oh, this isn't just a human you're wrestling with the divine.
Yeah.
And when you said that, I think of the song "What If God Was One of Us," right? Like it is essentially going, okay, so how serious do we have with this incarnation bit?
Yeah.
In my first Jesus book, I make a joke about Jesus having wet dreams, right? Which is the question middle schoolers asked me for years as a minister. Like, well, how human, these kind of things. The rock star thing, I think, is important in the sense that he is a charismatic and compelling person, right? One of the things that's really hard in our contemporary context is to say any statement with conviction and a declarative form, right? We add the word like to everything, or perhaps, or we deflate our whatever our convictions are early on. And Jesus has very strong convictions, but those convictions are the kind that if you look at the dominant regime and go, oh, it needs a distortion pedal, right? Or it needs remixed, or when pop music becomes a way of challenging the dominant regime, he has that vibe, right? And the I think that the other element I would add is we know how his story ends. He ultimately is executed by the powers. You can, having spent some time on your playlist, some of those powers get told more honestly in secular stories than they do in sermons about the crucifixion of Jesus, because at a church that has an American flag next to it, it's not the time to say, hey, did you know that sometimes religion cooperates with the imperial domination system of the day and executes the people that actually God is most identified with? And I think a lot of us get this feeling, right, that that whatever story the world is running on right now is ultimately problematic and deserves to be judged. And if we want to explain our allegiance, if we want to kind of through art reflect on what another possibility is, the story of Jesus knowing he resisted it to the end, and that resistance comes with the divine affirmation that he was right, the resurrection, that is a beautiful place to play, and one that I think invites those that can't differentiate the flag with a cross on it from an American flag. Insert jokes about particular contemporary moments.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, that just reminds me of one of the songs I oftentimes use in my workshops, which is "Soldiers and Jesus" by James Otto. There's only two guys that I'm paraphrasing here, that only two kinds of people that have laid their life down so I could be free. When they're always there to pick up the pieces. Basically, thank God for soldiers and Jesus. Okay. And I think, yeah, I guess they both laid down their lives so you can be free, but they took really different approaches. Like one kind of literally was trained to shoot people, and the other literally said, do not shoot people. Well, not literally, but you know what I mean? So, but that goes to the point, how is Jesus incarnated or reincarnated in these secular songs, and what does that teach us? Right. And this maybe eventually leads us to Advent and Christmas, but it in my study of 600 songs now, by far the most common reincarnation of Jesus, that is to say, by far the most common image in which Jesus is reimagined in pop music is, can I ask you to guess? Unless you read my article. It's actually as pop musician. Of course, God created us in God's image, and then we return the favor, right? But another way to say that is that why are artists drawn to Jesus? Because they see themselves in Jesus. And so when they write songs, the highest praise you can give to Jesus, if you're a pop star, is to describe him as a rock star, right? Or as a as a rock star, or compare him to Elvis. There are a lot of songs about Jesus and Elvis, right? Again, how do you, and of course, country musicians, of course, describe him as a country, not just a country boy, but also as a country musician, right? Hip hop artists, this is pretty unique among hip hop as a genre, present themselves as Jesus or Jesus as themselves. But the idea is, broadly, pop musicians see things in Jesus that resonate with them, that impress them, and to be less cynical, allow them to understand Jesus better. So that's part of the attraction. Now, that's just the beginning of the interesting thing, because the question is, how, when you identify yourself with Jesus or identify Jesus as someone who shares your identity, then there are a lot of implications that you can scratch at and learn from, on the positive and the negative side. But fundamentally, I think pop musicians and listeners like to hear Jesus songs because they see Jesus as resonant with an authentic, rebellious speaker of truth who basically says, screw you to the powers. That's what pop music tries to do. And that's what Jesus tried to do.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get to, more timely a conversation about Advent, Christmas, and such, I'd love for you to kind of lay out the typology that you develop, because and maybe give an example or two for each one, because like maybe example of one that most people know, and maybe one that no one knows about, because I think everyone should definitely go check out the playlist. You can lose some sleep checking them out. You will end up adding songs to your own Spotify list or following Dell's. And if you're part of the current Advent group we're running, Dell's going to make a special Advent related playlist for us. So, but before you get specific, I'd love you to lay out the way you develop a typology or typography. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
the theologian develops typologies.
And musicologists talk about, taxonomies of different kinds of genres and stuff. So we'll start with T and just add.
It starts with T, and they're organized in categories.
I love it. I'll take it. Taxidermy.
No songs are killed in the making of these lists.
So when I started this project, I had to draw some boundaries, right? And I really, I had to decide. Well, actually, the question you didn't ask me, but I'm going to answer anyway, which is why Jesus for me in this project. And the answer is that there are a lot of pop songs out there about God. And that is an extremely amorphous term, as we all know. Secondly, I'm a Christian, and that's the only tradition I understand. And I'm trying to figure out how to be a Christian today. So for me personally, it's going to begin and end with Jesus. The names in the church, right? You know what I mean? The name's right there, Christ. So I only looked at songs and only researched songs that are clearly about Jesus. So they either say Jesus, they say Christ, or it's really clear. There is an interesting category of songs that are possibly or probably about Jesus, but it's hard to tell. And I think, interestingly, What If God Were One of Us is it Paula Cole? I can't remember her name. That's one where I include on my list because I'm like, dude, God was one of us, and if he would take the bus, So, but that's about as wishy-washy as I get, because I really want to see songs that are trying to wrestle with the figure of Jesus from the Bible or the character of Jesus from the Christian tradition. So my research has only brought me to 600 songs at this point, which is still way more than I thought I'd ever find, So then I basically, spent weeks and weeks trying to say, what are like you do when you develop a taxonomy of something, you try to heuristically trying to figure out, try to deduce from all of this music, like what are the trends? And I basically found sort of three main trends, I call them domains. One of the songs in which Jesus is presented as, I call him these are songs that I call the person domain. And they are basically songs in which Jesus is presented only as a person, shorn of any kind of theological characteristic. And those songs are oftentimes really interesting. So for example, you could put into this characteristic you could put like New Friend Jesus by Craig Finn who's from the Hold Steady, one of my favorite like indie rock bands. And it's basically one of these songs like, chilling, wouldn't it be great to hang out with Jesus? And it's kind of funny and stuff. And it's not too theological, it's not too offensive. It's not too offensive or, offensive positively or negatively. Right. And then there's a song like, Beer with Jesus by Thomas Rhett. If I could have a beer with Jesus, I'd, of course, microbrew, he'd fill it up like his cup with the good stuff. And that song scratches some questions.
Specifically West Coast IPAs.
I love it. Absolutely.
None of those New England ones, Mr. Boston.
We all incarnate Jesus according to our own image, right? Like you said, man.
Yeah.
So, and there are a lot of those songs. Some of them are silly, like, Are You Drinking With Me, Jesus by Jello Biafra, who is from, Dead Kennedys, right? He was, super hardcore. And that's basically one of these songs you mentioned about the Jesus and Wet Dream thing. Talks about meeting up with Jesus at a bar, and like Jesus is like, has to go pee, right? And frankly, Jesus would have to go pee. He did have to go pee. And if you deny that, well, what's that? Docetism? You'd know better than me. Oh, yeah. You know what I mean? So
heretic alert.
Yeah. So thanks, Jello. You're towing the orthodoxy line. So those songs are, there are about how many of those songs? I found about like 100, maybe like 170, 100 of these songs. And those are kind of fun to listen to. Then there are the songs that view Jesus as a paragon. And by the way, since I've been an evangelical, I know that you got to have three. It's got to be alliterative, and it's got to be three. So the domains are person, paragon, and presence. I don't even have a ministry degree, man, but I'm impressed with myself.
I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, it sounds better than prophet, priest, and king. That's true. If you're doing Reformed Christology. Yeah.
Though Lord, Liar, Lunatic does come into my project, so I'm pretty.
You know what the fourth option is?
Tell me.
Just freaking option. Okay. Just freaking awesome. That was that was my addition to the options. In the Homebrewed Guide to Jesus, available wherever fine books are sold.
Which I own. I love. So the songs Jesus is a paragon. There's a lot more of those, and those are songs where Jesus is usually just referred to like in passing, but in typical sort of deconstruction, it's the passing references that really teach you. Like when you just throw away that Jesus is like, he's, just as I love him as much as I love Elvis, country songs like that. That actually tells you a lot about how you think of what love is and what you think about loving Jesus means, right? So there are, and if you go to my website, delvincase.com/Jesus, you can read all about this, and there are playlists that have all these paragon songs. So if you want to see like all the ways Jesus is held up as the greatest example of X, you can do that. By the way, he's usually held up as a powerful figure more than anything else, a figure that has extreme power, though oftentimes that power is the power to get chicks, which is not really biblical, but it's a way contemporary people recognize his power.
I mean, there's more females in the church than males.
That's true. And Mary Magdalene and stuff.
Watch out, Dale.
I know it's complicated. So there's those songs that are about Jesus sort of fundamentally as a human. Then there's the songs where Jesus is invoked sort of as a paragon for some kind of value, often has just power. But the biggest category, the biggest domain is what I call presence. And these are the songs that really present Jesus in a way that sort of is, in an interesting way, allows us to engage with the questions about who he is and what he stood for and what he was telling us. And in there are basically four categories. And it's kind of amazing how if you look at these 500-600 songs in this, in this collection, most of them fit one of these four categories. And they are as what I call a heavenly savior. That's a savior who forgives sins or sends you to heaven. There's the Jesus who I can call a worldly savior, the one who you pray to and who helps you in the here and now, or who helps society be better, not just personally. There's Jesus as a judge, who is either an apocalyptic end of time judge who shows up in metal a lot, okay, in secular metal, of course. And then there's also the Jesus who judges you for your personal sins, like a recent song is like Jesus Ain't Watching. A lot of songs in country music, they're like, well, I'll go to a church on Sunday, but Saturday night and Jesus ain't watching, And then, so that's interesting. Jesus as a personal judge and like an end of times judge. And then there are the songs in which Jesus is presented as a source of truth, like a religious teacher or leader. And those are the songs that really let us dig into like questions of faith, right? Because there are a lot of Jesus songs that view him as a religious teacher, but ultimately reject his message. And man, those are songs that I think we as secular Christians, I personally benefit from, because they're asking the same questions that I ask, but I just don't sing those songs in church,
Yeah.
like that 1975, great, they're kind of like a pop dance band. I like those guys, they get a lot of crap, but I like them. They got a great song called If I Believe You. This is a prayer called If I Believe You, Jesus, Show Yourself. And the song just ends there, right? And we don't know in the song itself if Jesus does show himself or not. Like it just ends with this like minute-long outro that's just unanswered. And man, how many times have you and I prayed for answers and don't get them? How many times have the psalmists ended up saying, yet we don't sing these songs in church, And so that's an example of a song. If you don't know the song, If I Believe You, it's incredible, and it's a terrain where we get to hear someone else address Jesus as if he exists. Yet, and I say these are songs full of faith because they have taken the risk of praying to someone who might judge you, right? Or who might not even be there, but you're still writing a song about it. Like that's faith, whether or not they end up saying Jesus doesn't exist, that's a faith-filled song, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're getting on to the point of like why I think this project is relevant and necessary,
Yeah.
But anyway, which is a separate topic. But anyway, there you go.
Well, no, I mean, I think the the typology or the taxidermy is really helpful, and if people are interested in this, they should definitely go to the website and check it out, because there are playlists on the page next to the descriptions for each of these different categories. You can just even scroll through them and go, oh, okay, yeah, I know that song. I get what's going on. You'll also see ones where you're like, wow, I wonder what that like. I'm hung like Jesus. I don't know. Yeah. Like there's a number of ways that could go. So
it's a great song.
I think as a resource, it creates a space for where these songs from a whole host of different artists. I love earlier you said testimonies, right? Like they're giving testimonies to wrestling with these big questions and voicing and giving space for experiences that often don't exist in or exist in public, in faith communities and worship. What were the surprises for you as you not just found 600 and some songs, but also listened to them enough to get confident about making sense of it?
That's a big question. Well, there are some surprises. Sort of the major surprises of them, and are actually sort of the main takeaways on using the broadest sort of zoom lens, like turning off the zoom lens, right? The first thing that I found is that there are almost no anti-Jesus songs. And I would have thought these are secular. I grew up in the evangelical world thinking that, it's not just enough for a song to be about Jesus. If it's the idea of common grace, the idea that there's a revelation, like that other people could be teaching us about Jesus outside the church, which of course is in the Bible. Like, hey, Jesus, there's another prophet preaching your name. What should we do? The communities I grew up in basically said that's too dangerous. It might be the devil. Which is the challenge of it's the hump to get over if you're looking at secular pop culture as a resource for theological thinking. I think most of your listeners are over that hump. And many people like Barry Taylor have done the fantastic job of paving the way, right? So I basically thought that I'd find a lot of offensive Jesus songs. I found almost nothing. There were a few. There's some funny ones. Drop Kick Me Jesus Through the Goalposts of Life. Famous, song from the early 80s, right? Nothing offensive about that, except it's just silly. What I found, man, is a lot of anti-Christians songs, a lot of songs that are prophetic. They are giving us a word that the church needs to hear, and they have more power because it's funny. There a fair number of these, basically, let me backtrack for a sec. You got a lot of songs that are calling out Christians for the world that we've made, but they do so by presenting first an orthodox understanding of Jesus. And they say, first half of the song, here's who Jesus is. Might as well use that in Sunday school. The second half is, so why don't you guys follow him? And man, that's a prophetic word that like we need to hear, and it's a reflection of the world that Christians have made, right? From, it's basically a great way for us Christians to really see how other people view the world we've made. And it's not pretty, man, in a lot of ways. So that leads me to the second sort of big surprise for me is how powerful and valuable so many of these songs have been for my faith, but also for I think the life of the church, how valuable they are for us, as a resource, not just to fix the church, not at all, but also to like really grasp, grapple with the tough questions we've been talking about. Like, I just wasn't prepared for this to become essentially, and forgive me, I know I'm going to hell, like a modern gospel, like a Christology, a 600 chapter exploration of who Jesus is today and why he matters. It's kind of a gospel, or it could be used as a gospel if you enter into it with that kind of mindset, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, I think that's very helpful. So I want to turn in a sense to songs that resonate with the season and such. And I wonder if you could at first pick one of the songs that kind of run through your mind if you were going to make an Advent playlist or a Christmas story style playlist, and tell us about the song and then how you kind of receive it, process it, and then would kind of wrestle with that song, but also locate it in the way Jesus is showing up in pop music.
Yeah, a bunch of questions. Well, let's see. I'm gonna look at my list right now. Well, you and I have talked about the Rebel Jesus by Jackson Brown.
Yeah, which is one of the greatest songs of all time.
Every year that some evangelical writes an article online about what a horrible song it is and why it's unfair. It's unfair, right, to Christians. And if you don't know it, I'm just going to Google the lyrics so I get it exactly right. This is a song that is written by an agnostic or atheist, Jackson Brown, admittedly so. He has been interviewed about this song. And he basically, the whole idea of the song is that essentially Jackson Brown is basically saying, I worship, I believe in some kind of mystical spiritual realm. I find it in nature. He says, this time of year, though, all these Christians say they call him, they have their own faith and it's about Jesus. And they call him the Prince of Peace, the Savior. And they pray to him upon the seas and in every bold endeavor. And they fill his churches with pride and gold. And as their faith in him increases, but they've turned the nature that I worship in from a temple to a robber's den in the words, not of Jesus, in the words of the rebel Jesus. So like, first of all, straight up cleansing the temple, like guy knows his Bible. Secondly, hypocrisy, international capitalism. What do you want to call it? Calling out the church for implication, destroying the environment in the name of progress and colonialism and capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But then it ends with, that this is not just Jesus, it's the rebel Jesus. So he's willing to name and claim Jesus as a rebel who speaks not just to Christians through the Bible, but to him. Because remember, he's writing a song about a character that he likes, that he buys into, and it's the rebel Jesus, right? And so again, the next stanza is, we guard our world with locks and guns, and we guard our fine possessions. And once a year when Christmas comes, we give to our relations. And perhaps we give a little to the poor if the generosity should seize us. But if anyone of us should interfere in the business of why there are poor, they get the same as the rebel Jesus. So every church in America should sing this on the first week of Advent. And then there should be
Yeah.
a discussion after the service in the fellowship hall. Right? It's not a heavy lift to say why we need this song.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, even the lines after that, though, like he's aware of how this sounds, right? So, pardon me if I seem to take the tone of judgment, for I've no wish to come between this day and your enjoyment. In a life of hardship and earthly toil, there's a need for anything that frees us. So I bid you pleasure and I bid you cheer from a heathen and a pagan on the side of the rebel Jesus.
So good.
Good. Yeah. Also, I just want to say Jackson Brown's one of the kindest people. I had multiple little connections with him when I lived in Los Angeles and mutuals. And he, despite his, at least if you're a Christian, alternative religious identity, he was very committed to lots of the local nonprofits and fundraising and supporting, even played music at some that our church did and stuff. Like, he's just a wonderful human. I think he in the song captures, or because he's not in the church, he gets to say to the church what a lot of people in the church wish they could say. But
you're right.
Like he puts it in a song, and but I think the last verse is important, where he's like, look, I'm not saying if this story animates you, connects you, brings you your people, and it helps you find a beautiful moment, like, I don't want to kill that. I'm just saying, perhaps, maybe you should stay on brand, Team Jesus.
And this is a great example of the many sort of anti-Christian or anti-hypocrisy songs that I found. A lot of them look, most of pop music is generally progressive in its, if not radical in its ideology. You're going to find it in hippie leftist folk music. You're going to find this kind of message in metal. You're going to find a lot of this message in punk and hardcore with this whole like stick it to the man kind of thing. But this song, what's nice about this song is two things. One, it kind of functions metaphorically for the whole project, because a lot of these songs, these artists are not necessarily anti-Jesus or even they're not even some of them are anti-Christians, right? But many of them are just like, okay, I'm gonna write a song that explores this topic. It's 1 out of 12 songs in my record. Like, there's a band, called Bad Religion. Look, they got a lot of these. They kind of have a bone to pick because of the name of the band. But most artists aren't like animated by having it out. Just when they're inspired to write a song about Jesus, this is oftentimes what comes out. So the other thing I want to say about this song, and this goes along with the idea that he's basically saying, enjoy the season, but why don't you think? Is, I'm a musician, so I'm always looking not just at lyrics, but at the way the music sounds. This is a beautiful Irish-inspired song. It sounds almost like an ancient Irish song. In fact, it was on a record by the Chieftains, okay? And the tone of it, the mood, is beautiful. This could easily be used in a church service. It's very singable. And that actually could give it potential power liturgically. And I know some churches that have used this.
I've definitely used it.
And so it's the music helps us it supports the tone of the lyrics, which is, as you said, I don't want to get between you and the story that resonates, but just stop and think a minute. Now, of course, a hardcore punk tune or a metal tune, the music itself creates this sense of urgency, violence, and despair and intensity that does different stuff. And we need that as well. That's like Jeremiah versus, like a psalm, depending on the psalm, and we need both of those approaches as Christians. But I love that this song also is beautiful and kind in the way it sounds. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's helpful. So when, a framework you gave, this is an example of the presence domain. And then ultimately it's one that is positively disposed towards Jesus and critical towards the church and its public witness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you have Home by Another Way by James Taylor?
I should
on your list.
I should look, and if I don't, you better add it to the database.
I know, because I was trying to think of one I didn't see, at least on the sample ones, but it because it's about the Magi and Herod. It's not like Jesus is there, but
Ah.
it's like literally the cool, and it's one of the others where the point gets made. So the lyrics, he goes, those magic men, the Magi, some people call them wise or oriental, even kings. Anyway, those guys, they
Mm.
visited Jesus. They sure enjoyed their stay. They then, warned in a dream of King Herod's scheme, they went home by another way. And then the course is they went home by another way. Maybe me and you could be wise guys too and go home by another way.
Mm.
And so it retells the story. And then the as wisdom, right, is
Mhm.
not doing and participating with Herod the king's
Mm.
scheme. And the next verse he goes, safe home as they used to say, keep weather eye to the chart on high, go home by another way. Oh, that was the end of the chorus. Steer clear of royal welcomes, avoid a big to do. A king who would slaughter innocents will not cut a deal for you. He really, really wants those presents. He'll comb your camel's fur until his boys announce they found trace of mounts of your frankincense, gold, and myrrh.
Mm.
And in the second course, he said, time to go home by another way. Home by another way. You have to figure the gods saying play the odds and go home by another way.
Whew.
And then he said, you can more or less assume that you'll be welcome in the end. Wait, okay, yeah. Mustn't let King Herod haunt you or fantasize his features when you're looking for a friend. Well, it pleasures me to be here and to sing this song tonight. They tell me that life is a miracle, and I figured that they're right. But Herod's always out there. He's got our cards on file. It's a lead pipe clinch if we give an inch. Old Herod likes to take a mile. It's best to go home by another way. And it's one of those songs where he retells a story. He states it in the moment. And then the last verse is like, hey, we could be wise. We already know that. Like, when you're looking for friends, don't look for Herod. Look for the lowly. Like, it's just a beautiful song. And it, like you mentioned earlier, a lot of them are about as orthodox as it gets.
Yes.
He's literally telling you this is what happens in Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens today. And perhaps we would rather be friends with Pharaoh and Herod and Caesar than faithful and wise to the one in a manger. Oh, it's so good.
Fantastic. And I was looking, I actually don't have it. I do now. You're the best.
Oh yeah.
Well, so this is
that was going to be my addition to the class Advent playlist. So even though it's technically Epiphany.
Well, yeah. And look, you could say it's a Herod song, right? But again, why? Yeah. You could what I would do if I were to analyze that song, I would say, so who is Jesus in this song? What does he represent? There's a vulnerability. I mean, in this song, he's a foil, right? A character foil. But why is Herod after him? Because, I mean, he's a tiny little baby who is also threatening the powers that be. And that is a very orthodox way to describe who Jesus is in the Bible, right? But it's not one we like to listen or think about because of the implications. We always like to think that we're on the side of Jesus, but I think we all know that if Jesus were to come back, when he comes back, we know what side we're on. In fact, that leads me to mention that there are a lot of songs I found, these songs that are in the judge category, that imagine if Jesus comes back, what he'd find. There's a number of songs on the list that imagine that and tell that story. And interestingly, a lot of them are country songs. And country music's not really known so much for its progressive politics, but there are
contemporary country, old school.
And it's true. Even there are, that's true. But even so, it's surprising to see. Again, if you were to search the database by country, you find a lot of songs that are essentially worship songs. They don't add much to the conversation really. But the songs that really, and you find a lot of songs that are like Soldiers and Jesus and Elvis, Jesus and Jack Daniels. A lot of songs that recast Jesus in an image that is very comfortable and makes sense to sort of Southern evangelical culture, right? But then you got a few of these songs that are like, Jesus is going to come home, he's going to clean house. And I think we need those. When it comes to the season trip, I wanted to point out a song. You mentioned Epiphany on the flip side. Well, let's talk about Advent. There's a great song by an R&B singer named Michaela Jean, it's Jene, who I didn't know before this project, and it's called The Annunciation. And she sings, when I was 14, God gave me a dream. An angel came and told me I was created to sing, and the gift that I would carry and all the joy it could bring. But honestly, it scared me. But I said yes and believed, right? It ain't easy being pregnant with with a purpose so much bigger than me.
Oh,
So
junk.
incredible R&B song, right?
Yeah.
Here's a black woman talking about being, I mean, she's reincarnating herself as Mary. She's talking about imagining if she was a young black woman and pregnant, right? Here's a space where I step back and I just say, listen to the song, folks, right? And what does it mean if you're uncomfortable? You know, think about who Mary was, right? She was living she was an oppressed religious minority. She was a woman at a time in a patriarchal society, right? She was unmarried, right? If Jesus announced, if Annunciation happened today, where would it happen? In whose womb would it happen? To make the same point, right? And I think this song raises some really powerful questions. And I think this song should be played at the beginning of Advent in every church to really, these songs oftentimes refresh these old images of Jesus, kind of what Dom is talking about, right? Like, you got to remember how radical these stories are. And some of these songs, when they recast these well-worn, very well-known stories, these are not Victorian era stories, right? These are radical stories about poor people trying not to get killed. And pop music refreshes them in our minds sometimes. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It's a great song. Check it out. It's called The Annunciation. Oh, yeah. That's a cool Advent song, not a Christmas song per se,
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And one of the things I find about, I mean, you mentioned U2 earlier, but like even then, like one of their Advent songs, "Peace on Earth," which is literally a reflection, right, on what the angels say.
Yep.
If you were to think of the most likely U2 songs we played at church, that's not one of them, because it ends up getting really direct about how that beautiful scene, usually with cute kids as both angels and shepherds and stuffed animals and sticks and sheets on, and things like that scene, and peace on earth, do it. Like in that song, it puts it in our present context, and basically goes like, what BS, right? Like, and we're the reason it is. And it's I feel like the challenge of Advent, that the church gives us in some sense, is to go, if you don't stop and wait and look at the world and ask questions about how different the character of our times and our history and our systems are from the character of the God we see in Christ, then you will learn to adapt, accommodate, justify, and then compete within a system that's ultimately being judged as the place love, hope, joy, and peace have yet to come. Right. And so Advent each week is this call to the church to pause and to look and to anticipate something more than our world as it is and our hearts as they are can bear coming. And that statement is just hard to really say if you are in a congregation, and because in some sense it goes, the church, great, we're glad you're here. Also, we are a temporary institution. We succeed by becoming unnecessary, because in the end, it is the coming of God for all creation that we look to, right? Like this, not a time to justify our presence, and our existence. It's a time to look at how we failed and where we need to go. And those songs that take those biblical narratives and set them in our time without the demands of confessional communities, I think get more to the text than
Well, it's that process of defamiliarization, which if you're a literary theory nerd or whatever, what does art do, right? Shklovsky said art makes a stone stony, right? It helps you actually look. A poem about a stone helps. A good poem ought to help you see again meeting a stone for the first time, right? Help you realize what makes a stone a stone. Like, stop taking for granted the stones, because every stone is individual, it's different, right? It goes there and there, right? It goes on and on and on, right? And so a lot of these songs, like even the ones that are kind of sappy, like for example, Trisha Yearwood has a song called "It Wasn't His Child" from 1994. Okay. And it's basically, he was her man, she was his wife. And one winter night, he knelt by her as she gave birth, but it wasn't his child. It wasn't his child. Okay. And this song goes on and it tells the whole story. And by the end, you're like, yeah, okay, Joseph. Now, however you want to interpret the Luke narrative, okay, it actually happened. It's a great spiritual biography. Blah, blah, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The fact is that Joseph, someone comes to him and says, hey, your wife's pregnant. You're not your wife is pregnant, right? And then he sticks with her and then gets on that donkey and spends all this time, middle of the night, nowhere to sleep, right? And the baby finally comes out, and all the time he knew it wasn't his child, right? Now, the implication of this song is very theological, right? It's God's child, right? And in fact, it says that. But again, let's defamiliarize Joseph. Think about it from Joseph's perspective. Props to Joseph for sticking with her, every single step, because he wasn't even on the donkey, man. He had to walk to Bethlehem, every single step. He's like, well, I'm doing this for somebody else's child, like that's helpful for us. Even though the song is kind of sappy and it's like country, whatever, like, why not? Why not think about that dimension of the story?
Yeah.
Does that sort of make sense? I mean, it's not super challenging, but it also defamiliarizes a story that we all know and has been domesticated. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I mean, even in the first session, like when Dom was drawing the contrast between the two Annunciation stories, right? Like Luke, you get the Annunciation to Mary, and in Matthew, you get it to Joseph. Mm-hmm. And all the little details of Joseph having to get it, you get 4 of them in Matthew, 3 of them related to Joseph. Annunciations are collapsed over when in most of the combination of the two, right? So you get the Mary one, but Joseph is worried. He's ethically suspicious of things until the Annunciation. Anyway, so it is a to me the thing. We have the Christmas stories are very much gifts to us, and so often sentimentality, the desire to harmonize them, and the way they ultimately get framed, in a lot of ways because of Christendom, but also because of capitalism and the way it gets monetized. It's like we took out all the spices out of a dish and then are like, don't you enjoy this? And a lot of good art or good preaching or good scholarship, like what Dom's been doing in the class, what they do is defamiliarize us with the story so that you actually have to wrestle with it again. Right. And pay attention to the claims that are being made. And I just think that's a real gift, and you can wrestle with them while at the same time going, well, I'm not really sure about God. And I'm not exactly, actually it might be better be described as a pagan and I worship in nature, if you're Jackson Brown or these kind of things. The gift of the stories, when taken seriously and not in some sense occupied and framed by mammon, nationalism, sentimentality, then they're ultimately gifts that invite us to take our own existence and our community and the possibilities for our world much more seriously.
I mean, if there were to be a New Testament, like, what's the space in society where God might reveal God's self, right? And I think it would have to be it wouldn't be in the church. It would have to be a place that, first of all, has more streams than the church. But secondly, it would have to be in a space that, one of the few spaces left that really challenges us and makes us get uncomfortable as a society. And pop music, I mean, I'm a scholar of pop music, so I tend to be biased, but like, whether it's questions about gender or sexuality or sexual ethics, these were raised by pop music long before they were really raised in Hollywood or if you look in the 20th century, right? It's that pop music is at the vanguard of challenging us, because the songs they're oftentimes they're non-visual, they're ephemeral. But look at what Prince was doing, or David Bowie, right? I mean, there are people. Look at Little Richard wore makeup in 1950s. Here's a black man raised in the Pentecostal church singing the blues, wearing makeup, and white people bought his music in 1956. Tutti Frutti's about gay sex. If you don't know the original versions of that song, it is, right? Yet we still dance to it in 1956. 55, whatever. Like, we're way ahead of the curve. So I think if God's thinking, what terrain can I get my, provocative message out? I think it'd be secular music.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm biased, but
Yeah. And in this very wonderful book called Christ in a Pluralistic Age, John Cobb, it's one of my favorite books of all time, kind of talks about in a sense, the migration of divine embodiment into art in our contemporary culture. And anyway, that'd be a long detour, but that's what popped in my head. Now, I want to make sure everyone listening knows that there'll be links to everything on the post. For those of you that are currently part of the Christmas Stories class, I will be sharing with you all the playlist that Del is bringing. And if you're in there, we want to know if you have other songs that come to mind. Maybe for any of his larger project, go ahead and let us know if there are ones that he should make sure to add to the database. Spend some time looking over it. Let us know if there are questions and such that pop up. But I think it'd be a blast to have our the class as a collective make a sweet Advent playlist. And
oh my gosh, and yeah, if you go to the website delvyncase.com/Jesus, so you can download like a spreadsheet of all these songs. You can listen to the playlist for all the different things. But at the bottom there is a searchable database, and I want to crowdsource this. So you search the song, and it's not there. There's a form, you can add it to my private, if you will, a research document, and eventually it'll make its way into the project, into the book, into the website. So man, there are a lot of songs that I don't know still. So yes, please add them to the database. And I'll double check the playlist too to see if people just add it there. There's a ton of great songs that, it could be the next really powerful song that, becomes a part of this project, basically.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, awesome. And there's also contact stuff there if people are interested in connecting with you. Look, Dale's a fun communicator. Plus, it's music, and it gets people to ask questions and such. So if you are a part of a congregation and you would like a very fun guest speaker to help people start asking big questions around Jesus using pop music that culture is asking, maybe make your congregation uncomfortable enough that they wrestle again with the text, then definitely holler at Dale. He's in the group, by the way. If you are in it and you're in the Facebook group, definitely connect with him there and such as well. Anything else pop in your head? I have one final question. I may even edit out depending on how it goes.
Well, I guess I would say that one other cool thing that I have learned from this project is how much I can learn about how much these songs show me my unconscious bias about who I think Jesus is. Because every song that I come into that sort of offends me, and there's not a lot, that of course makes me think, well, why am I offended? And every song that I think, oh yeah, that's definitely who Jesus is, same thing happens. Well, why do I think that? Am I just guilty of the same thing that all these everyone does, which is reincarnating Jesus as ourself, right? So either way, one of the main points of my book is that even the songs that offend you, that are heterodox, that are heretical, they still can be valuable for your faith by causing you to examine what's your response and why. You know, it's just like we always think of ourselves as being on the side of Jesus, but frankly, we're the Romans, you know, and we need to remember that consistently. And these songs, even the ones that offend us, think like, why am I offended by the idea that Jesus might be drunk at a bar and have to go pee? You know, he drank wine, he had to go pee.
Yeah.
So what does that tell me about who I think Jesus is and what I think how I should imagine his true nature, right? I mean, so even if you're offended by these songs, like take a second and think about what they're making you, how they're challenging you, basically.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, plus, I mean, I really feel like you've confirmed that Jesus prefers very dry West Coast IPAs. That's what I remember. That's my takeaway, Dill.
Oh, I'm so sorry to tell you, but if you listen to all the country songs, that's not what they're drinking in these honky tonks, man. I just don't think they are. You know,
no, Jesus likes PBR.
They also like Jack. He definitely drinks Jack Daniels in a lot of country songs, of course.
Well, I understand that. That.
Anyway,
I'm a Southerner. I understand. Jack Daniels is its own genre of alcohol. Okay, so here's the idea I had, and I think is entertaining, and I wonder if something like this is possible. But you know, as you're going through the project and thing, you find all of these different songs. I think it'd be fun to have a band that's called the Jesus Cover Band, or Covering Jesus, or whatever. But it's essentially a band that only plays cover songs of songs about Jesus, and I love it. And then because you could orchestrate it where there's an album of Jesus songs, and they're all around the topic, and you know, if you did like 10 of them that are around each category or each thing, where in a sense the band covers these songs, puts them together, and then goes like, you're performing them and covering them to ask like, what are these songs together as a collective asking?
It's like
and it would be fun because you could do different versions. You know, you make it sound like it's a cohesive album, but all the songs are written by someone else.
I love that. It's like the world's worst worship band, because all the songs make you say, "Oh crap," you know. But you could also do something really cool, which is you could take some of these really hard, like literally hardcore punk songs, and you could do like a acoustic cover.
Oh yeah,
which really changes the way we receive the music. And so you could do, heck, you could take the same song and cover it in like 5 or 6 different. Can you imagine a lot of these songs covered in like a reggae style? How that would totally change how we think about Jesus, you know?
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of songs. Jesus was a stoner, you know, by Cypress Hill, by the way, the hip hop group, you know? So yeah, I mean, I love that idea. I think that's definitely a show that needs to happen at Wild Goose or something. You know?
Oh, I mean, I'm like, it would be fun, and it is it does something. It's a way of taking seriously not just the individual songs, but like the cultural moment that pop music is a place where all these whole new wrestlings with Jesus happen. And, you know, yes, you can experience on a playlist, but when a band has taken the time to figure out how to do a collective, cohesive cover album of those songs, where the album, in a sense, is one voice. That is a kind of like, how do you interpret these songs? Like, one way is what you're doing, like the intellectual work and framing it culturally and all that kind of stuff. But the creative music version is like, what if a band does a cover album of them? And what genre do you pick? What songs do you pick? It would be fun. It popped in my head, and I was like, oh, that sounds like excitement.
Yeah. Well, why not? I was joking about a worship band. Why wouldn't you have a worship service using these songs? Like, why not sing along to a song that's like, Jesus, I don't know if you're there, or I don't know whether to believe you or not. Like, there's nothing. The Bible tests essentially, you know, it values these kinds of questions, you know, and even these songs that challenge us Christians to wake the heck up and consider how we're part of the problem. Why not sing them in a corporate context and follow them with a prayer of confession, right? This could be the world's best worship band. When you think about it, I love this idea. The other thing I was thinking, Trip, is that what you just described isn't that just a gospel? It's some guy has an idea about who Jesus is, takes a whole bunch of other stories, chooses them carefully, describes them in a certain way, and then hands them to us. Isn't the gospel just like a concept album with Jesus covers?
Yeah, well, your playlist is the Q source. Is that the?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Maybe not that's what I'm saying, but Matthew didn't come up with any of these original. We don't think Matthew just came up with them. They're all cover versions.
Well, I mean, if you are familiar with the oral tradition of the Sermon on the Mount, and then don't put that in, it's depressing. It's depressing.
No, I love it. I love your idea. One of these days, I'll be touring with my Jesus band, which I like. I like that idea. Again, I think churches, I have worked with some churches who have used some of these songs liturgically as part of the sessions I run, but it'd be really fun to do a whole service.
Well, do like it's funny. You could pick all a bunch of songs and do hymn versions of them.
That's right.
What would happen if you did these songs as hymns, and you make the music to match it for the hymns? You could pick ones that are like the angry, fast ones, right? Like punk, metal, this kind of thing. Do them as folk songs, and all of a sudden the lyrics are played out in a different way.
Well, also, all you would need to do, all people, may not know this, but most of the hymns we sing, the texts are completely separate from the tunes, and they have just been come together over time. So you could take any hymn tune and fit a pop song. Like Rebel Jesus could be, we guard our world with locks and guns and guard our fine possessions. And once a year when Christmas comes, we give to our relations. It works. You could take a hymn tune and stick these words and it would work. And no one would even know. They would just find themselves, what did I just sing? Wait a minute.
When Jackson Brown gets the 7-cent check because the CCLI license used Rebel Jesus lyrics in worship, he's going to be like, huh?
What the heck?
Awesome.
Yeah, that's a great idea. These are great ideas.
It's been a blast.
Hey, thanks a lot.
If you listening are independently wealthy and would like to send Dell and I money to, create a concept album,
dude, right.
Let us know.
Start a record label.